Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are exploring a life story that feels almost, well, it feels almost mythic in its tragedy and its timing.
It really does.
We're talking about a life that was just defined by this extraordinary potential, this inherited fame, and an utterly devastating, senseless act of negligence that cut it all short. We're talking about the actor and martial artist Brandon Lee.
And it is truly impossible to address Brandon Lee's career without immediately drawing that profound, almost cosmic parallel to his father, Bruce Lee.
It's uncanny.
It is. I mean, both were these dynamic rising stars. Both were poised to break through into that definitive mainstream leading man status.
And both died tragically. Young Brandon at 28, his father at 32, just before the release of the very films that were meant to cement their legends.
For Brandon, of course, that film was The Crow.
That parallel just gives the entire story this deep, tragic resonance. So today we're undertaking a deep dive into the extensive biographical source material that's available. We're going to track Brandon Lee's life from his turbulent youth through his complex, conscious attempts to step out from his father's immense shadow.
And right up to the catastrophic technical failure that ended his life on a film set in 1993.
Exactly.
Our mission here really is to extract the crucial insights that define Brandon Lee as an individual. We need to look at him not just as the son of an icon, but as an actor who is dedicated to classical training, a thoughtful martial artist, and perhaps most surprisingly, a serious philosopher in his own right.
And we also have to dedicate some serious time to meticulously reconstructing the sequence of events that led to the accident. I think it's so important to move past the folklore and focus intensely on the cold, negligent facts of that technical failure.
Absolutely. The facts are what matter.
You know, what really stands out to me in the sources right away is the sheer wealth of information about his artistic preparation, his dedication to the craft of acting, and his thoughtful, intellectual approach to something like fight choreography. This was a man consciously building a major career on his own terms.
He absolutely was. And when you start connecting those dots, his early acting studies in New York, his philosophical deep dives into self-knowledge, it just delivers a real sense of depth far beyond the action genre he was usually associated with.
Right.
He was a truly adaptable learner, someone who actively questioned the path that the world really expected him to follow.
So let's begin at the beginning. Brandon Bruce Lee was born on February 1st, 1965, in Oakland, California.
And because of his father's exploding international career, his earliest years were shaped by just constant movement, shifting between Hong Kong and the United States.
A lot of back and forth.
A ton. And this movement ended abruptly and, of course, tragically. Bruce Lee died suddenly in 1973. Brandon was just 8 years old.
Just 8.
And that single event did more than just take his father. It cemented this inescapable, almost defining legacy, a powerful, iconic shadow that was instantly cast over his entire existence from that point forward.
And he spent the rest of his life navigating that shadow.
He really...
The martial arts training, that started incredibly early, right?
Yeah.
Even while his father was still alive.
Oh, yes. His grandmother, Grace Ho, she noted this remarkable anecdote that really illustrates his physical talent in that early discipline. By the age of 5, Brandon could kick through an inch board.
At 5 years old.
At 5. That level of focus suggests some exceptional training starting in his, preschool years. It confirms he had the inherent ability and the direct instruction.
So after his father passed, he continued training.
He did. It was almost a necessity, given his name, but it quickly became this source of significant internal conflict for him. Starting at age 9, he trained with Dan Inosanto, one of his father's closest students. And later, he also trained with other prominent figures like Richard Bustillo and Jeff Imada.
And it was Jeff Imada, who would later become his stunt coordinator and a close friend, who provided that crucial insight into Brandon's psychological struggle during his teenage years.
What did he say?
Imada observed that having to train in dojos where these large photographs of his iconic deceased father adorned every wall, it just troubled him deeply. It was the constant unspoken pressure to live up to a myth.
And just think about that pressure, not just professionally, but psychologically. Every single time he stepped onto the mat, he wasn't just learning a skill. He was standing under the banner of a legend he could barely even remember.
It's just unimaginable.
And this internal struggle, it became overwhelming. It led to a period of explicit rebellion and total abandonment of martial arts in his mid-teens.
He didn't just quit. He actively swapped that world for something completely different. He chose to play soccer instead.
Which was such a clear attempt to carve out a space for himself, a space where the ghost of his father wasn't defining his every kick or every movement.
And this rebellious streak, it also extended into his academic life, didn't it?
Yeah. It did. The source material notes he was a troubled and rebellious student. He was ultimately asked to leave the prestigious Chadwick School for misbehavior just 4 months before he was supposed to graduate in 1983.
But he got his diploma.
He quickly obtained his GED from Miralest High School that same year, which just confirms he was intelligent but really struggling with discipline and expectation.
But the crucial pivot, the really important shift, came after high school. His shift from that martial arts rebellion wasn't a return to action. It was a deep dive into classical dramatic training.
Yes. He moved to New York City and just immersed himself in serious studies at the renowned Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute.
And he complemented this by majoring in theater at Emerson College in Boston. He even appeared in legitimate, non-action stage productions, including a play by John Lee Hancock called Full-Fed Beasts.
In that decision to pursue classical acting, drama, and theater, it proves he was profoundly serious about acting as an art form, a discipline defined by emotional truth and character, not just a way to leverage his last name or his physical skills for quick fame.
So by the mid-1980s, we have this really complex individual, someone with world-class physical ability who deliberately rejected that part of his identity to pursue the intellectual and emotional rigors of classical acting.
Exactly. When he returned to Los Angeles in 1985, he initially worked as a script reader. He wasn't even seeking the limelight.
But he was spotted by a casting director, Lynn Stallmaster, which led to his first credited role. That was in the feature-length television film Kung Fu, the movie in 1986. A follow-up to the really popular 70s TV series.
And this is where that initial reluctance is just so key. Despite the offer, his former instructor, Jeff Imada, who was working on the film's stunt department, he recalled that Brandon had to be actively persuaded to even accept the role.
Because he was explicitly avoiding genres that were so closely associated with his father's work.
He really struggled with the idea, but the sources indicate he eventually accepted it because he found a certain measure of historical justice in the casting.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he knew that the original pilot for the TV show had actually been conceived for his father, but it was ultimately given to David Carradine. So his participation in the follow-up, playing the illegitimate son of the main character, Kwai Chang Caine, it carried a special significance for him, a sense of delayed, partial reclamation of that history.
I see. So after this initial foray back into the martial arts world, he then plunged immediately into the intense environment of the Hong Kong film industry.
He did. In 1986, he starred in Ronnie Yu's action crime thriller, Legacy of Rage. This was his very first leading film role on the big screen, and it provided a really unique context for his international career launch.
And it's highly notable because Legacy of Rage was the only film Lee ever made in Hong Kong, and the only one in which he performed in Cantonese.
Which just speaks volumes about his commitment to professionalism, to learn the language for the performance.
And even though director Ronnie Yu later stated they didn't always get along during the shoot, the film was a massive commercial success, especially in Japan.
And it earned Brandon a nomination for a Hong Kong Film Award for Best New Performer. He proved instantly that he could carry a major film on an international stage.
His return to U.S.-based genre films was a bit slow and uneven after that. His 1990 film Laser Mission, shot in Namibia, was critically panned. It was a very low-budget venture.
It really was. But commercially, it was a huge success in the burgeoning home video market.
And that detail is so critical. It demonstrated his rising star power and his draw as an action figure, even when the production quality itself was lacking. He was generating profits, and Hollywood noticed that. He was becoming a known commodity that translated into rental and sales success.
But the major decision, the one that perhaps best eliminated his complex, often painful relationship with his father's legacy, came in 1991.
Universal Pictures.
Yes, Universal Pictures listed him as a serious contender to play his own father in the major studio biopic, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story.
And he rejected it outright.
He did. He stated publicly that he found it awkward and too strange to play his own father, especially having to dramatize the intimacy of his parents' romance.
I mean, that would have required him to literally embody the mythology that he had spent his entire youth trying to escape.
And there were logistical concerns as well, reported in the sources. A producer had noted he did not look Chinese enough and would have refused to work on the project if they had needed to use makeup or prosthetics to make him appear more Asian.
Which just reflects the pressures of racial authenticity in casting at the time.
For sure. The role ultimately went to Jason Scott Lee, no relation. But what makes this choice so fascinating is the advice Brandon gave Jason.
This is incredible.
It is. Jason reported that Brandon told him, and this is just truly profound for someone living under such a large shadow. He said, "I wouldn't survive in this part if I treated his father like a god."
Wow. He needed to demystify the man.
Exactly. Brandon continued telling Jason, he said his father was, after all, a man who had a profound destiny, but he was not a god. He was a man who had a temper, a lot of anger, who found mediocrity offensive. Sometimes he was rather merciless.
That quote just perfectly encapsulates Brandon's desire for realism and for humanity. He was rejecting the manufactured idol worship that had defined his public life and the public's perception of his father.
To treat his father as a flawed, complex, human man, not some immortal deity, that was the only way Brandon could integrate that legacy into his own life without being consumed by it.
And that must have taken immense maturity and psychological clarity at such a young age.
It absolutely did. It required him to be honest about the man, not the myth, which is exactly the opposite of what the studio system wanted from that biopic.
So by the early 1990s, after navigating that very difficult choice regarding the biopic, Brandon's focus shifted squarely to solidifying his own career in Hollywood.
His American feature debut was Showdown in Little Tokyo in 1991. It was a Warner Bros. Buddy cop film co-starring Dolph Lundgren.
And this film had a very difficult path. It was released in a limited manner, and it did not fare well initially with critics or audiences.
No, it grossed a mere $2.27 million domestically. For a major Warner Bros. Action vehicle, this was a significant commercial disappointment. It suggested he still hadn't fully cracked the mainstream American market.
I can only imagine that must have put immense psychological pressure on him. I mean, after rejecting the easy path of the Bruce Lee biopic, his next major feature just fails to take off.
It must have been a time where he had to truly decide if he was going to continue pursuing his own vision.
And he did.
He did. The material notes that despite its initial failure, Showdown in Little Tokyo later gained status as a cult film, which shows the enduring appeal of his presence, even if the vehicle itself is flawed.
But the real momentum, that gathered steam a year later with Rapid Fire in 1992, produced by 20th Century Fox.
This marked a significant positive turning point.
Rapid Fire, directed by Dwight H. Little, saw Lee play a student named Jake Lowe, who witnesses a murder. And what made this film stand out was Brandon's involvement far beyond just performing the action sequences.
Crucially, he was actively involved in the story development, and he connected deeply with the central plot point of his character, Jake Lowe, losing his father. This was where he began integrating his personal history into his art in a controlled, therapeutic way rather than avoiding it entirely.
There's a truly moving anecdote from the sources about his dedication to this role.
What's that?
The stunt coordinator, Jeff Imada, he observed Lee using a book of his own father's work, specifically Bruce Lee's philosophical writings, to emotionally prepare for the scene where his character loses his dad. He was using his family history as method acting material.
And that's a fundamental change from his early rebellion. He was using the source material of his life, not running from it.
He also exerted significant creative control over the physical elements, right? He and Anada are co-credited for the fight choreography.
Yes, and they incorporated elements of his father's Jeet Kune Do, but adapted it for the character. And he insisted on giving the character a specific identity, saying he wanted to keep a sarcastic edge so the character wouldn't just become, Joe Action Hero.
He pushed for nuance and humor alongside the violence.
And the critics and the box office responded positively. Rapid Fire debuted at number 3, earning $14.3 million total.
And while critics were mixed on the film's script, there was consistent praise for Brandon Lee's charisma, his screen presence, and his undeniable star power.
The general consensus was that he was just too good for the material.
This success was the definitive tipping point. Following Rapid Fire, he signed a massive 3-picture deal with 20th Century Fox and a multi-picture deal with Carolca Pictures.
So his career trajectory was officially locked in. He was transitioning from a genre specialist to a bona fide mainstream Hollywood leading man.
And this secured trajectory led directly to The Crow.
In the fall of 1992, Lee landed the role of Eric Draven in director Alex Proyas's adaptation of the Dark comic book. This was intended to be his vehicle, showcasing the acting depth and physical intensity he had been honing for a decade.
The character of Eric Draven is just steeped in gothic tragedy and raw vengeance. A rock musician resurrected by a supernatural crow to avenge his own death and the brutal attack on his fiancée.
And Brandon demonstrated such deep artistic insight into this character from the moment he landed the role. The producer, Jeff Most, he noted that while Lee loved the script's lyrical lines, he insisted on focusing on brevity and rhythm in the dialogue to make Draven threatening and otherworldly.
So you wanted to strip away any unnecessary exposition or dialogue that would slow down the film's pace or humanize Draven too much.
Exactly. He was so committed to the concept that Draven was unique, not a standard action hero. He successfully argued for streamlining the script, limiting metaphysical characters to only his own.
And he also modeled the aesthetic of the character after the singer Chris Robinson, ensuring Draven had a specific rock aesthetic, which informed his physical preparation.
And that preparation was intense, but it was intentionally counterintuitive for an action star. He wanted to look like a lean, haunted rocker, not a typical muscular martial artist. The sources detail a rigorous, intense diet where he would meticulously weigh his food to remove bulk and achieve that specific, gaunt look.
And his workout regimen was tailored to this goal. He focused heavily on cardiovascular exercise, spending hours on the Stairmaster, running using a jump rope.
And instead of heavy lifting, he used high repetitions on lighter weights to elongate and stretch his muscles, along with Muay Thai classes and aerobics, all aimed at losing body fat rapidly and achieving that lean, rock aesthetic.
Crucially, the fighting style itself was dictated by the character's supernatural origin, not Brandon's actual training.
Right. Lee and the stunt coordinator, Jeff Imada, they agreed that Draven should not use conventional martial arts moves. The character, after all, only received supernatural, not trained abilities upon resurrection. He wasn't intended to look like a trained fighter.
So to make his movements unique and otherworldly, a sort of violent, fluid grace, they incorporated aerobics into Draven's fighting style.
Imada confirmed that Lee used his martial arts knowledge to choreograph, but he deliberately disguised it, making the fight choreography unique to the specific resurrected character.
The dedication to method acting was extreme, and the crew noted it throughout the shoot.
For the resurrection scene, which was shot during the intense winter of Wilmington, North Carolina, Lee actually requested bags of ice and submerged himself in them. He hypothesized that resurrection would feel freezing cold, a shock to the system.
He performed that scene barefoot and bare naked in the bitter cold. It just demonstrates a profound willingness to endure real physical discomfort for the sake of the emotional truth of the character.
And furthermore, the key hairstylist, Michelle Johnson, she noted that for the numerous rain scenes where he had to act without a shirt, he would soak himself beforehand in the cold weather, rather than waiting for the rain machines, just to maintain that consistent level of physical and emotional immersion.
He was just fully invested in this role as the defining performance of his career.
This dedication to emotional truth brings us to Brandon Lee's deeper philosophical pursuits. It's clear that while he sought to move beyond the genre his father defined, he never abandoned the philosophical depth that Jeet Kune Do taught.
After returning to the U.S. in the 1980s, he resumed training with Dan Inosanto.
His training was extensive and serious, covering disciplines like Eskrima, Silat, Kali, and Muay Thai. He was even certified by the Thai Boxing Association in 1991, showing his commitment to mastery.
And the source material reveals that years before his death, his mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, noted that Brandon became completely consumed with his father's written philosophy. He was taking lengthy, detailed notes and engaging in deep study.
And he applied this intellectual rigor practically to his film work. Inosanto recalled that Brandon would bring a camera to the training facilities specifically to choreograph fights, filming different techniques to see exactly which movements and philosophical concepts translated effectively onto the screen.
He was analyzing movement as a language.
He really was. When he was asked which martial art he practiced, his response was so thoughtful and revealing of his independent identity. He acknowledged his training in Jeet Kune Do, the art his father created, but he emphasized that JKD was his father's very personal expression.
That's why he clarified. It would be more accurate to say that I practice my own interpretation of Jeet Kune Do, just as everyone who practices Jeet Kune Do does.
He wasn't simply a lineage holder. He was an innovator and an interpreter, confirming his own autonomy within the art form.
And this drive for self-definition, it extended into a profound philosophy about self-improvement and embracing vulnerability. A concept that's deeply relevant to anyone, applicable far beyond physical combat.
He spoke extensively about confronting internal barriers as the path to true self-knowledge.
He detailed that when you move toward mastery in martial arts, or really any difficult pursuit, you inevitably come up against these massive internal barriers, limitations of will, ability, natural ability, courage, and how you deal with both success and failure.
And he believed overcoming these barriers was the key to true learning, resulting in something that conveyed a sort of spiritual sense about yourself.
What's so fascinating is how he described the process of confronting these limitations. He had this specific observation about the concept of being a child again when facing a true barrier.
He described it as a very interesting experience to be reduced once again to the level of knowing nothing about what you're doing.
That vulnerability, that moment where you realize you are an amateur again, that's something most people actively avoid once they achieve success in their careers or their lives.
He lamented this avoidance. He said, we reduce ourselves at a certain point in our lives to kind of solely pursuing things that we already know how to do.
Yeah. Because you don't want to have that experience of not knowing what you're doing and being an amateur again.
He believed putting yourself in a situation where the outcome is truly unknown, where you are forced to improvise and adapt, was far more illuminating than just resting on existing skills.
It's the ultimate expression of Jeet Kune Do's core principle, be like water, applied to life itself. Water doesn't know the path, but it flows and adapts around the barrier, forcing it to redefine itself.
And Brandon was consciously seeking to be challenged and remade, which makes his commitment to a complex, emotionally taxing role like Eric Draven so understandable. He was always pushing past his known limits.
He wasn't just performing action, he was performing philosophy. And that psychological depth is just crucial to remembering who he was outside of the tragedy.
Exactly.
We must now, though, turn our full attention to the moment that tragically cut short this career of immense potential. On March 31st, 1993, Brandon Lee was on the set of The Crow.
He had nearly completed all of his principal photography with only 8 days of filming remaining.
The scene involved his character, Eric Draven, walking into his apartment and discovering his fiancée being brutally attacked. Another actor, Michael Massey, was required to fire a Smith & Wesson model 629.44 Magnum revolver at Lee's character as Draven entered the room.
The distance was 12 to 15 feet.
And this shooting was officially ruled an accident due to criminal negligence. To properly understand the sequence of events, we have to look back at the highly unusual sequence of prop handling that occurred prior to the fatal scene. This is where the failure began.
The core of the failure lies in the preparation of the ammunition used in the preceding weeks. For close-up shots on the gun cylinder, where the audience needed to see realistic-looking bullets, the prop gun, which was a functional firearm, had been loaded with what are called dummy rounds.
But these were not professionally manufactured dummy rounds. The sources confirmed these were improperly made by the special effects crew themselves. They took live cartridges and removed the powder charge, essentially turning them into cosmetic pieces of ammunition.
And this seemingly innocuous step was the first point of failure. When removing the powder, the primer, the small explosive charge at the back of the cartridge used to ignite the powder, was often left intact.
So when the trigger was pulled during these close-up scenes, the primer fired.
Yes, and that provided just enough force to push the bullet tip out of the casing, but not enough energy to propel it fully out of the long barrel.
This created what is technically known as a squib load condition. A piece of the dummy bullet became lodged deep in the barrel of the revolver. And here is the second, most critical failure.
The prop gun was not properly checked, cleared, and cleaned by an armorer, the professional who is mandated to handle firearms before being loaded for the death scene.
So for the death scene, the dummy rounds were replaced with blank rounds. Blank rounds contain the primer and a significant powder charge, allowing for the loud sound and muzzle flash effects necessary for the scene.
But they are supposed to be completely harmless because they lack a solid, heavy projectile.
However, because that piece of the dummy bullet was still lodged and completely unseen deep in the barrel, when Massey fired the blank, the powerful propellant force of the blank acted on the lodged piece, propelling it out of the muscle with lethal velocity.
It essentially turned the lodged bullet fragment into a real lethal projectile, striking Brandon Lee in the abdomen.
This reveals a systemic breakdown of safety protocol. The standard procedure for prop guns, especially after using dummy rounds, requires visual and mechanical inspection, often using a clearing rod to ensure the barrel is completely clear.
And the source material confirms this necessary check was neglected.
The immediate aftermath was just confusing and devastating. Lee fell backward, which was contrary to the planned choreography for the scene. When the director called cut, the crew initially thought he was still acting.
Or maybe playing a joke, given his known sense of humor.
It was his friend and stunt coordinator, Jeff Inmata, who first realized the severity of the situation. He approached Brandon and noted he was unconscious and breathing heavily, realizing instantly that something was terribly wrong.
The medic on set, Clyde Basie, he initially thought Lee was only days from hitting his head when he fell, as there was no immediate, visible, external bleeding.
But the internal damage was catastrophic, and within 2 to 3 minutes, Lee's regular pulse slowed dramatically and then stopped.
He was immediately rushed to the New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington, North Carolina. The severity of the internal injury, the projectile had caused massive bleeding, perforating the stomach and major organs, required 6 hours of emergency surgery.
The medical team tried to save him.
They did. But tragically, despite their efforts, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead on March 31st, 1993 at 1:03 p.m. He was 28 years old.
The sheer technical negligence involved, the failure of the safety chain of custody, the improper preparation of ammunition, and the failure to clear the barrel is the profound tragedy here. This was not an unavoidable accident inherent to filmmaking.
No, it was a completely preventable error that occurred because basic safety standards were ignored.
Despite the overwhelming tragedy, only 8 days of filming remained for The Crow.
And Brandon's fiancée, Eliza Hutton, and his mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, they provided crucial support. They backed director Alex Proyas's difficult decision to complete the film as a testament to Brandon's dedication.
To finish the remaining scenes, they had to rely on pioneering cinematic techniques. First, stunt doubles Chad Stahelski, who was a longtime friend of Brandon's from their time training together, and Jeff Cadiente served as stand-ins.
But the truly pioneering aspect involved the early use of computer-generated imagery. Advanced, and at the time very expensive, CGI techniques were used to superimpose Lee's face onto the stand-ins for those final remaining scenes.
This necessity inadvertently pushed the boundaries of visual effects technology to address this just unprecedented situation.
When The Crow was finally released in 1994, the combination of its quality and the tragic circumstances created an overwhelming cultural event. It opened at #1 in the United States.
It grossed $11.7 million in its opening weekend and ultimately grossed $50.7 million on a $23 million budget.
This success made The Crow the most financially successful film of Brandon Lee's career and solidified its immediate place as a major cult classic.
The critical reception was also overwhelmingly favorable. The film holds an 87% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with reviewers praising the unique visual style, the action, and Brandon Lee's central, highly committed performance.
But the tragedy cast an unavoidable melancholic shadow over the entire viewing experience, something critics consistently noted. Desson Howe of The Washington Post wrote that Lee haunts every frame, making it an eerie conclusion to his career.
James Bartonelli called it a case of art imitating death.
And his death and the film's success, it triggered immense interest in his prior work. A month after he died, his films Laser Mission, Showdown in Little Tokyo, and Rapid Fire also a major unexpected surge in home video sales.
The entire industry was left contemplating the immense talent that had just been lost.
Shortly after Brandon's death, the film Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, premiered. And the producers, acknowledging the shared destiny of father and son, dedicated the film to Brandon with a powerful quote. "The key to immortality is first living a life worth remembering."
That tragic parallel between the two figures, both dying young just before their definitive breakthrough films, was unavoidable. It led to the reemergence of conspiracy theories surrounding his father's equally early death.
Brandon Lee was ultimately buried next to his father at the Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, Washington.
And in terms of legal accountability,
Brandon's mother, Linda Lee Cadwell, filed a negligence lawsuit against the filmmakers in August 1993, alleging negligence that caused her son's agonizing pain, suffering, and untimely death.
that suit was settled just 2 months later under undisclosed terms, bringing a measure of closure but not really justice to the incident.
The full measure of Brandon Lee's life, I think, is found not just in his action films or his complex identity struggle, but in his philosophy.
In an interview just prior to his death, he quoted a passage from the American writer Paul Bull's book, The Sheltering Sky.
This was a deeply personal quote for him. It was a passage he had selected for his wedding invitations to his fiancée, Eliza Hutton.
And it is now poignantly inscribed on his tombstone, serving as the final word on a life that ended far, far too soon.
The passage reads,
"Because we don't know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. And yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20. And yet it all seems limitless.
Brandon Lee was a man who was profoundly conscious of the finite nature of human existence, who articulated the need to embrace vulnerability to truly grow, even as he was preparing for a life that seemed boundless in its potential.
And his tragic, negligent end forces us all to reflect on those words, reminding us that life, even a brilliant one, is not an inexhaustible well.
A life worth remembering indeed. For you, the listener, maybe consider how Brandon Lee's pursuit of mastery, his insistence on putting himself back at the level of the amateur, might challenge your own approach to growth. How often do you consciously choose the path that you already know instead of the path that forces you to confront your internal barriers?